Hello, my name is Amechi, and in this video, I'm going to guide you through a comprehensive cybersecurity lab. Using Microsoft Azure, I'm going to build, test, investigate, and secure a network environment. Along the way, I'll address real-world challenges and cybersecurity threats. Whether you work in cybersecurity or are just curious, this video will share insights and practical skills relevant to the ever-evolving landscape of digital security. Here's a roadmap of how we're going to do that. For this cybersecurity demonstration, I'll start with my local computer on my home network. To build out the rest of my resources, I'll use Microsoft Azure. Azure is a cloud computing platform that lets organizations create virtual resources like virtual machines, virtual networks, and cloud storage in a cloud environment. Now, using a virtual network will ensure the integrity and safety of this demonstration because all activities are confined to isolated environments within the Azure cloud. So this minimizes any risk to my local machine and network. I'll access Azure via the web from my local machine. Then, using Azure, I'll create Azure Shared Resources and 2 virtual networks. As indicated by the name, the Azure Shared Resources will include things like Entra ID, Active Directory, Microsoft Sentinel, which is a security information and event management software system, blob storage, a key vault, active logs, and Windows Defender for Cloud. Now let's go back to those 2 virtual networks I'm going to make. The first virtual network will be my target network. This network will contain a Linux virtual machine and a network security group, a Windows virtual machine and network security group, and a vulnerability scanner with a network security group installed on a second Linux virtual machine. The Windows virtual machine on the target network will have a number of resources installed on it, including Microsoft SQL, Microsoft SQL Server management software, Windows Defender Firewall with advanced security, and purposely old and vulnerable versions of Firefox, VLC Player, and Adobe Reader. The vulnerability scanner will also be installed on the target network. In this lab, I'll be using the Greenbone Open Vulnerability Assessment System. The second virtual network I'll deploy will be an attacker virtual machine that I'll use to simulate attacks against my target network. So, from a bird's eye view, my environment will look like this. All of my resources will be in the cloud on the internet and contained in the Microsoft Azure environment. The Azure environment will contain the shared Azure resources, the target virtual network, and the attacker network. A central and necessary component of my monitoring and analysis will rely upon logs generated by my environment. Logs are critical in cybersecurity as they give detailed insights into network activities and enable the detection and analysis of potential security threats and anomalies in real time. I'll configure both of the resources on my virtual machines as well as my Azure Shared Resources to send logs to a log analytic workspace. This log analytic workspace will serve as a centralized environment for aggregating, storing, and analyzing the log data. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be using Azure Sentinel as my SIEM. After connecting my SIEM to my log analytics workspace, I'll add rules that trigger incidents when specific actions occur in my environment. Once all of my resources are deployed and configured, I'll simulate some attacks to my environment and confirm my logging and SIEM rules are working. After I'm sure everything is functioning properly, I'll leave my environment running and exposed to the internet for 24 hours. It's important to reiterate that while my virtual environment will be deliberately configured with minimal security controls to simulate vulnerability, this is an experimental setup and isolated within Azure. I'll use unique and complex passwords for all my accounts, and the absence of any external network connectivity to my local machines will ensure that this cybersecurity demonstration remains a safe, controlled experiment solely for educational purposes. But with absolute certainty, malicious actors will find my exposed environment and do their best to compromise my network and cause mayhem. My incident response will be in line with NIST Special Publication 800-61 Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. After leaving my network vulnerable, I have a number of incidents to respond to. Azure Sentinel will help me easily track all of my incidents, and my actions will be guided by an incident investigation playbook. After investigating and responding to my incidents, it'll be time to harden my network. In doing so, I'll adhere to NIST Special Publication 800-53 Security and Privacy Controls for Federal Information Systems and Organizations. Azure's Microsoft Defender for Cloud will provide additional clarity when applying these security controls. But I'm not done yet. I'll also use my vulnerability scanner to perform both uncredentialed and credentialed scans to discover common vulnerabilities and exposures. The Greenbone Open Vulnerability Assessment System will identify any issues. I'll remedy those weaknesses as well. Now to open my network to the internet again for 24 hours and see what the malicious actors can do. After hardening my network, the threat agents should be much less successful in their attacks. Let's get started. I'll start by creating the necessary resources in Azure, including a resource group to organize my resources, a Windows virtual machine, and of course a virtual network. Next, I'll intentionally create a security loophole by setting up an insecure rule in a network security group, which acts like a firewall to allow in all inbound traffic. I'll RDP into my Windows VM and disable Windows Defender Firewall with advanced securities to remove an additional layer of security. Using Powershell from my local machine, I'll confirm the Windows VM is accepting ICMP traffic from remote machines by pinging the VM, thus indicating the firewall is indeed turned off. Here, I'll install a SQL Server on the Windows VM to create a service that can potentially be hacked. Now to install Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and enable logging, which of course is crucial for monitoring a system's activities and indications of attack, both simulated attacks and potential real-world attacks we might experience later on. let's simulate some failed login attempts to the SQL Server. Now we'll use the event viewer in the Windows VM to review the logs of those failed attempts. In addition to the Windows VM, I'll set up a Linux VM to be another target for attacks. Now I'll follow the same process of creating a vulnerable inbound rule in a Linux VM's NSG. Now to create an attacker VM in a separate network to carry out some of the simulated attacks on the VMs. From my new attack VM, I'll generate some failed logon attempts to the Windows VM. Now to simulate a successful brute force attack on the SQL Server. And I'll also simulate a brute force secure shell attack on the Linux VM. In the event viewer, let's check out the failed SQL and RDP logins. And let's look at the Linux syslog to view the logs for the failed secure shell logins. Now I'm going to set up some user accounts at various levels, tenant, subscription, and resource, in Entra ID, previously Active Directory, to manage access and permissions. Now I'm going to create a storage account to store logs and some other data I'll be uploading later. Of course, this is also another target for an attacker. Now, to add a very important element I'll use for monitoring and analyze activity in my environment, I'm going to create a log analytic workspace to collect and aggregate data from my resources. Another critical piece of software I'll be using is a security information and event management tool, also called a SIEM. As I'm in Azure, I'm going to be using Azure Sentinel. This will allow me to more effectively monitor, detect, investigate, and respond to security incidents. Here I'm going to set up Sentinel, connect it to Log Analytics Workspace I made earlier, and create a watch list. A watch list will help me correlate events within Sentinel using geolocation and IP data that I'm going to upload. Now let's enable Microsoft Defender for Cloud to provide some additional security intelligence and connect it to my Log Analytic Workspace so I capture those operating system logs. Here I'm configuring the flow logs for my network security groups to record information about the traffic passing through my environment. The logs will be sent to my storage account. I'm setting up some data collection rules to specify what data should be collected and where it should be sent. For this project, I'll set the rules up to focus on malware detection events and system events related to the system element of the Windows firewall with advanced security. Now, to install monitoring agents on both the Windows virtual machine and the Linux virtual machine. These agents will gather information about potential security events from each machine. Here I'm going to configure diagnostic settings to export sign-in logs from Entra ID to my log analytic workspace. Now to make a few new users. As a contingency, I'm going to make a break glass account in case I do something stupid like lock myself out of the primary global administrator account by mistake. Then I'll make a dummy user with global admin privileges for testing purposes. And lastly, I'll create an attacker account for simulating attacks. To see if everything's working properly, I'm going to simulate a brute force login attack against Azure services. The goal is to determine whether my setup accurately tracks and records the incidents. Now I'm going to configure the diagnostic settings for the Azure activity log so the logs are exported to the log analytic workspace. Now let's try and generate some logs from the Azure activity log by creating and deleting a couple of resource groups. And I'll also create and delete a rule in a network security group to try and generate some more logs. Heading over to the storage account, I'll configure the diagnostic settings for the blob storage account so its logs are also exported to the log analytic workspace. Now I'm going to add a new resource to my environment. I'm going to create a key vault, which is a tool for secure management of secrets. Accordingly, I'll generate a secret to my key vault related to a mock tenant global admin password. We'll be using this later for testing. Now I'm going to configure the diagnostic settings for the Key Vault so the logs are exported to the Log Analytic workspace. Now I'm going to test the Key Vault log capture and export by creating, viewing, and deleting a new secret within the Key Vault. I also want to test the capture and export of logs related to my storage account. So I'm going to create a new storage container, upload a test file to that container, and then edit the file. Heading back over to Sentinel, I'm going to add a workbook. So workbooks are interactive dashboards and visualizations that can help provide insights to my data. First, I'll delete the default workbooks because I'm not going to be referencing them in this project. I'm going to create 4 workbooks created on specific queries. These queries will focus on detecting failed Linux Secure Shell authorizations, failed Microsoft SQL Server authentications, failed Windows Remote Desktop Protocol authentications, and malicious traffic allowed in by NSGs. So my queries reference the watch list I created earlier to visualize the correlation between the IP addresses and geolocation data. Now I'm going to test out using a scheduled query rule to capture logs. In this scenario, the rule is designed to detect and alert on patterns that indicate a brute force attack on Windows RDP into my Windows VM. Now to try and trigger that rule. To do that, I'm going to perform a brute force attack simulation on the Windows VM. Heading over to my log analytic workspace, I can run a query to verify the attack's log entries show up. I also want to take a look at Azure Sentinel to see if the simulated attack shows up there. Once I confirm that the incident was created, I'll delete both the incident and the rule as they were just for testing purposes. Earlier, I manually created an analytics rule in Sentinel. For my lab setup, I want to add 13 rules, so to streamline the process a bit, I'll automate things and import the rules all at once using a JSON file. Now that the analytics rules are all added to Sentinel, I'm going to try and trigger a few of the rules to test them out. I'll start with simulating a successful brute force attack to Entra ID. Next, I'll try to simulate a brute force attack to the Microsoft SQL Server. To trigger the malware outbreak rule, I'll be using ICAR files instead of real malware. Not only is it easier, but it's safer because I haven't set up the requisite environment to safely use real-world malware. So first I'll experiment with manually adding one ICAR file via Notepad, and then I'll use a PowerShell script to add 15 more files in quick succession. Next, I'll trigger the possible privilege escalation rule by accessing the key vault and viewing the secret value for the mock tenant global admin password I created earlier. To trigger the Windows host firewall tampering rule, I'll turn the Windows Defender firewall on and then turn it off again. And to be clear, the firewall is off in this instance because the environment is deliberately vulnerable for the purposes of this lab. Lastly, I'll trigger the excessive password reset rule. Although I've created and configured multiple security monitoring tools in my environment, my setup is missing a vulnerability scanner, so let's do that right now. In this lab, I'll be using the Greenbone Open Vulnerability Assessment Scanner hosted on a Linux VM. After setting up the new virtual machine, I'll retrieve my access credentials and log into the Greenbone web portal. I want to be certain my scanner has some vulnerabilities to detect, so I'm going to install outdated versions of VLC Media Player, Adobe Reader, and Firefox to my Windows VM. These outdated versions of the software all have known vulnerabilities, so the scanner should pick it up. To configure the vulnerability scanner, I will define a host. Hosts are potential scan targets. Create a target. Targets are specific systems to be scanned, and set up a task. A task is essentially the scan operation itself. After that, I'll launch an uncredentialed scan on the Windows VM. The scan is uncredentialed because it will be performed without using credentials. Let's take a look at the results of that uncredentialed scan. In the results tab, 3 vulnerabilities show up, but none of them are the outdated software installed on the Windows VM. Nonetheless, there's a lot of helpful information. FYI, removing the filter displays the results with the severity of 0. Configuring for a successful credential scan is not conducted solely within a Greenbone web portal. I also need to RDP into my Windows VM and make some configurations there as well. I'll turn off user account control notifications so the scan won't be interrupted by prompts asking for permission to make changes to the system. Then I'll enable remote registry service so the scanner can access and scan the Windows registry remotely. And along those lines, I'll set a registry key to allow remote access to credentials on a virtual machine. Of course, I also have to add credentials for the credentialed scan. Now it's back to the familiar process of creating a new target and task for the credentialed scan. Finally, launch the scan. Now let's look at the credentialed scan. Right away, we see the results tab of the report has increased from 3 to 87 results. I also see the vulnerable software now shows up in the scan. Again, reviewing the rest of the tabs will display a whole bunch of helpful information. Looking deeper into an individual result, I see CVE identifiers. CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. If we go to the National Vulnerability Database on the NIST website, we can find out more information related to that vulnerability. If I needed the software on my VM, I would update the software to the current version to remediate the vulnerability. But for this lab, I'm just gonna delete them. I don't need them. Now I'm going to run a second credential scan to ensure the vulnerabilities related to the outdated software no longer appear in the results. Now let's look at the credentialed scan. Immediately I can see the results have decreased from 87 to 7 vulnerabilities. A few more vulnerabilities then showed up in the uncredentialed scan, but that is to be expected. And I can also download the report as a PDF if I want to. Just prior to this module, I left my vulnerable environment running for 24 hours, wide open to the internet where malicious actors are always probing for new victims. What I'm going to do now is gather some baseline metrics regarding the security incidents that occurred during that vulnerable 24-hour period. I'll do this by running KQL queries in the log analytic workspace and recording the results in a spreadsheet. Pretty old school, but good for the purposes of this lab. I also want to check out my workbooks to see a visualization of the security incidents. As this is a new network and the time frame was only 24 hours, my workbooks don't show results for failed Linux SSH authorizations or failed Microsoft SQL Server authentications, but that's understandable under these circumstances. We've observed there are a bunch of security incidents to investigate. In this lab, I'm going to conduct my incident response in line with NIST Special Publication 861, Computer Security Incident Handling Guide. The 4 parts of this set of guidelines are preparation, detection and analysis, containment, eradication and recovery, and post-incident activity. The preparation stage includes activities such as setting up the work environment, establishing playbooks, and creating an incident response plan. The detection and analysis stage includes things like alert monitoring, incident analysis, and alert documentation. This is where an analyst might use an incident investigation playbook. Whereas the containment, eradication, recovery stage is where an analyst might use an incident response playbook. After the incident is resolved, we get to the post-incident activity stage. Looking at the Sentinel's incidents blade, I see 10 incidents I can look into. Let's take a closer look at a simplified incident investigation playbook, since that's what I'll be doing in upcoming sections. Incident alert analysis in Sentinel, detailed incident review, visual exploration and scope assessment, incident validation and classification, documentation and initial reporting, and incident handoff or resolution. But first I'm going to cheat a little bit. I see there's an alert for a successful brute force attack against my Windows VM, but I looked into the incident before recording this section, and I know it's related to the Credentialed vulnerability scan I conducted earlier. So remember, I expanded my time window of analysis to 4 days, so I had more to work with this incident response section. Accordingly, we have this known false positive that I'm not going to conduct a full investigation on. My first real analysis will be investigating an alert for a brute force attempt into my Windows VM. I'll start by reviewing the data provided by Sentinel. First, I'll assign myself the incident, classify it as active, and set the severity. I can adhere to my incident investigation playbook by using the various tools and resources available in the Sentinel Incident Dashboard. When sifting through the information provided by Sentinel, I see a Tactics and Techniques header indicating ID T1110 brute force. This ID refers to the MITRE knowledge database. If I visit the MITRE website, I can navigate specifically to the ID for more information about the technique. I keep seeing the IP address 87.250.175.120 as the other entity involved in an incident other than my Windows VM, of course. That deserves additional investigation. I also want to take a look at Sentinel's visualization tool for further insights into related incidents, associated entities, and the relationships between them all. I'm going to leave the Azure environment for a moment and use some external resources to investigate that suspect IP address. First, I'll check out Cisco Talos Reputation Lookup. I've used this primarily for email investigations, but it doesn't hurt to check the IP address here as well. But there's not a whole lot of information, so we'll move on. Next, I'll check out VirusTotal, where I do get hits from multiple security vendors. And I can click through the various tabs for information. Lastly, I'll check out Abuse IP Database, where I find over 3,000 abuse reports from 149 different sources. I spent a lot of time engineering my system to house my disparate logs from multiple varied resources into my log analytic workspace. Now I can take advantage of that effort by running a series of KQL queries in the log analytics workspace to investigate this brute force attempt incident. With my first query, I'm looking at all successful logins. Over 20,000 results. Now I want to see the account names associated with those successful logins. Nothing immediately suspicious on his face except potentially the anonymous logon. Now I want to see both the successful and failed logins for that suspicious IP address. Over 4,500 results, and I'm seeing a whole lot of account names, and that's pretty interesting considering none of those accounts actually exist. These query results are indeed consistent with a brute force attack. And keep in mind, the incident I'm investigating is not one of my simulated attacks. This is an attack from the wild. Now let's narrow the search to only include successful logins for that suspect IP address. Great news, it looks like they never got in. Let's see how many failed logins there were. There were so many failed logins, Azure can only show me the first 30,000 results. Pretty crazy. Now focus on the number of security events for each user. I see a consistent count of 400 security events for a number of non-existent accounts. This is also consistent with an automated brute force attack. How about the external IP addresses with the most logins, both successful and failed? I know that 10.0.0.6 is the private IP address associated with my vulnerability scanner, so that count is to be expected. But I see the external IP address with the third most logins is our suspect IP address. How about login events with administrative privileges? Over 21,000 results. What were the account names associated with those admin privilege logins? Looking at the failed login types might be helpful. But logon type 3 makes sense as it typically indicates a failed network logon. The last query I'll run seeks to try and identify patterns or specific timeframes where security events are more frequent. Based on my investigation, I'm classifying this incident as a true positive suspicious activity. Though the attacker failed to successfully log onto my network, it did appear to be an attack. Further, the malicious traffic should never have reached the Windows VM in the first place, so even though the attack was a failure, I'll head over to the Windows VM NSGs and lock things down to remediate. Okay, let's look at my simplified incident response playbook for a brute force attempt against a Windows virtual machine. It turns out I already performed a lot of these actions during my investigation stage. Also, some of the actions don't apply since the attack was unsuccessful. In some organizations, remediation would be handed off to a different team, but of course for this lab, I'm your guy. I'll harden the system by heading over to the NSG related to my Windows VM. Of course, I'll delete that dangerous inbound security rule, but I'm also going to delete the RDP rule that allows any source. Lastly, I'll add a rule that allows my IP access to the network, only my IP. As the priority is higher than the existing rules, it will be applied first. Looking at my rules, my virtual network can only communicate with itself. My load balancer can reach any destination and my IP address has all access. All other inbound traffic is blocked by the final rule that is applied last. And while I'm here, I might as well secure my Linux NSG and attack VM's NSG. Now let's look at a possible privilege escalation alert. This incident actually is a result of the testing I was doing earlier regarding the key vault secret, so I know I'm going to see my IP address as an entity in Sentinel. Nonetheless, this is still good practice, so I'll take a look at the analytics rule and head over to the log analytic workspace for some queries. First thing I want to do is set my time range so I capture the logs I want to query. My first query will be simply looking for all audit events for the key vault. 12 results show up. Taking the time difference into account, I can tell I'm looking at the right batch of logs related to the Sentinel incident. Looking at the details for one of the logs, I see my user account that I used to view the key vault secret value. If I didn't recognize the account email, I could always search Entra ID and get more info. Since I know the user account that viewed the secret value, I can run a query for all sign-in attempts by that account. And per the incident investigation playbook, viewing the incident visualization tool can sometimes also be helpful. But again, I know this is not a real incident, so I'm not going to spend more time on it in this presentation. The last incident I'm going to look at in this lab is the malware detected alert. This incident was created when I saved those iCar files on my Windows VM. So again, This is an analysis of a simulated attack, but a helpful exercise nonetheless, starting with a review of the data provided by Sentinel. Before I start running queries in the Log Analytic workspace, I'm going to look at the Sentinel Analytics rule to refresh myself on what triggered the alert. And I see event ID 1116 that indicates that Microsoft Defender Antivirus detected malware, and event ID 1117 that indicates that Microsoft Defender Antivirus has taken action to protect against malware. Now let's run that query I just looked at in my Log Analytic workspace. There's a whole lot of information when drilling down on a log, so let's start with a rendered description. I made this just a bit easier for us to read. I can see there's a link to a Microsoft web page, and indeed it's information regarding iCard files. But there's even more information in the event data row. Again, I made it a bit easier to read. Among the results, I see the location of the suspect file, an indication that Windows Defender Antivirus successfully cleaned the file and that no additional actions are required. Now I'm going to focus on hardening the environment. I'll start by going over to Microsoft Defender for Cloud, reviewing both my security posture and a list of recommendations to secure my environment. Defender for Cloud's recommendations are great, but I want to adhere to the NIST SP 853 Security Control Framework. Fortunately, I can integrate the framework into my Defender for Cloud compliance dashboard. Once the framework is fully deployed, the Defender for Cloud Compliance dashboard maps to NIST SP 853, as can be seen with comparison to the published framework on the NIST website. I'll start by implementing an easy security control with a quick fix. Under the Access Control family, control name Account Management, Control Enhancement, Account Monitoring for Atypical Usage, identifier AC212. The first recommendation is Microsoft Defender for Resource Manager should be enabled. This remediation is easy because there's a literal easy button. It's that easy. Let's do another easy one. Under the incident response family, with the control name of incident reporting, control enhancement vulnerabilities related to incidents, identifier IR62. The compliance dashboard shows a recommendation subscription should have a contact email address for security issues. Even though this is a manual remediation, it's still a very easy fix. Implementing this security control will take a bit more work. Under the System and Communications Protection family, control name Boundary Protection, control enhancement, additional assessments, identifier SC7. Paraphrased, some of the recommendations are: the key vault and storage accounts should use private link connection. The firewall should be enabled on the key vault and storage account, and virtual network rules should restrict access to my resources. I'll start by enabling the built-in firewall on the key vault to disable public access, so only my stuff in my network can access it. Now I want to take my key vault off the public internet. To do this, I'll create a private endpoint connection for key vault. Heading over to the storage account, I'll rinse and repeat. Turn on the built-in firewall and create a private endpoint connection. Before I move on, I want to check out my network topology in the Network Watcher. I see my virtual network and default subnet. I can also see the private endpoints I created for my key vault and storage account. Let's see if my private endpoints are working properly. First, I'll RDP into my Windows VM and open PowerShell. Of course, my Windows VM and my Key Vault are on the same virtual network. Accordingly, an NS lookup of the Key Vault will return a private IP address. If I try to do the same thing for my local machine, which is not in the same virtual network as my Key Vault, I get a return of a public IP address for my Key Vault. And the same thing is going to happen for my storage account. I still have one more remediation I want to implement related to NIST SP 853 Boundary Protections SC7. That's a mouthful. I'm going to create an additional network security group to add an additional layer of security around my subnet and its resources. Let's see if the network watcher shows the new NSG in the network topology. Okay, so prior to this module, I left my Harden environment running for 24 hours, wide open to the internet, just like I did when my environment was vulnerable. Let's see the difference my changes made. Windows security events decreased by 87.48% just with a few changes I made. Not bad. Sentinel security incidents and inbound malicious flows allowed by NSGs were reduced to 0, so those are really good results. No surprise that no results show up in our workbook map visualizations. We've reached the end of this extensive cybersecurity lab, so thank you for joining me on this deep dive into building, testing, investigating, and securing a network environment using Microsoft Azure. We've tackled real-world challenges and applied practical solutions. Thanks for watching, and stay curious, stay informed, and keep pushing the boundaries of cyber defense.